In 1904, a family takes a Christmas photo. Decades later, enhanced technology reveals a sixth person reflected in the mirror, holding what appears to be a rifle. 3 weeks after this party, a business partner vanishes without a trace. Was this shadow figure planning murder at a Christmas celebration? In 1904, a family took a picture. Many years later, they found something scary hidden in it. In November 1978, Sarah Henderson went into her dead grandmother's study. The room was in the family's big house in Lincoln Park. The old Victorian house had belonged to the Henderson family for over 70 years. Sarah's grandmother had saved lots of family papers and memories there. Sarah looked through each drawer in the big wooden desk. She wanted to save what she could of her family's history. When she opened the bottom drawer, she found something hidden under some old papers. It was a photo album covered in leather. The metal clasp on the album was old and rusty. The leather looked worn from many years of use. Inside were old brown photos from Chicago's rich people in the early 1900s. Page after page showed fancy pictures of parties and family celebrations from long ago. One photo was different from all the others. It was a formal family picture from Christmas 1904. It showed 5 people from the Henderson family standing in their fancy living room. Cornelius Henderson was Sarah's great-great-grandfather. He stood next to his wife Margaret and their 3 children. Behind them was a big, fancy fireplace. Above it hung a large mirror with a gold frame. At first, the photo looked normal. It was just a typical picture of a rich Chicago family during the city's golden age. Sarah took the photo to Northwestern University where she worked. She helped professors in the history department. The university had just gotten new computer equipment that could make old photos look much clearer and bigger. The high-tech scanner captured every tiny detail of the 74-year-old photograph. On the computer screen, the image looked bigger and clearer than ever before. The technology showed textures in clothes, expressions on faces, and details of the room that no one could see with just their eyes. Professor Michael Chen watched the process with interest. The photo quality was really good for 1904. This meant the Henderson family had hired one of Chicago's best photographers for their family picture. Sarah carefully looked at each part of the bigger, clearer image. She studied the faces of her ancestors, their old-fashioned clothes, and all the fancy Victorian details of the room. Everything looked exactly like it should in a rich family's Christmas picture. Then she focused on the fancy mirror above the fireplace. Something strange appeared on the computer screen. Reflected in the mirror was a 6th person, someone who had not been part of the family picture. The reflection showed a man standing behind and to the left of where the photographer was. He was watching everything happen. Most scary was what he was holding in his hands. The reflection showed a man partly hidden in shadows. His face wasn't totally clear, but he was definitely there. In his hands, he held something long and thin. It looked very out of place for a family Christmas picture. They printed several copies to make sure what they saw was real. The figure was definitely in the original 1904 photograph. He had been caught by accident in the mirror's reflection. The object in his hands was about 3 feet long, but they couldn't tell exactly what it was. The next morning, Sarah took the clearer photos to the Chicago Historical Society. The head person there was Margaret Kowalski. She had worked with researchers for over 20 years and knew a lot about the city's important families from the early 1900s. The Henderson family records showed they were among Chicago's rich and famous people. Cornelius Henderson had made his money from steel and railroad investments. He took advantage of the city's fast growth after the Great Fire of 1871. The family owned many properties, including the Lincoln Park mansion where the photo was taken. Margaret found old newspaper pages from December 1904. The Chicago Tribune had written about the Henderson family's Christmas party. They called it one of the season's most elegant celebrations. The newspaper mentioned dozens of guests, fancy decorations, and a professional photographer hired to take pictures of the event. But the newspaper didn't mention any problems or strange things that happened during the party. Research about Chicago in 1904 showed a city at the height of its wealthy golden age. The World's Fair in 1893 had made Chicago a major cultural center. This attracted rich business owners and their families to build grand houses throughout the city. The Henderson family knew meatpacking kings, railroad bosses, and political figures. Cornelius Henderson served on several company boards. He had connections to City Hall through business partnerships and social relationships. However, 1904 was also a year of big social problems in Chicago. Workers and bosses often fought, and the gap between rich and poor people had created tension throughout the city. Several important families had gotten threatening letters. Some had hired private guards for social gatherings. Margaret Kowalski found references to the Henderson family in police records from early 1905. In February of that year, Chicago police had questioned Cornelius Henderson about the disappearance of a business partner named Thomas Garrett. The questioning was called routine and no charges were filed. Thomas Garrett had been a partner in one of Henderson's smaller businesses. It was a construction company that built houses in the rapidly growing neighborhoods around downtown Chicago. Garrett was last seen leaving his office on January 15, 1905. This was about 3 weeks after the Henderson family's Christmas party. The police investigation into Garrett's disappearance found no important clues. His business partnership with Henderson was ended in March 1905. Henderson took full control of the construction company. Thomas Garrett's disappearance had been carefully documented by the Chicago Police Department. Detective reports described a man in his early 30s who was married with 2 young children. He had shown no signs of personal or money problems before vanishing. Garrett's wife, Elizabeth, told police that her husband had been worried about problems with the construction company's money. He had mentioned finding mistakes in material costs and worker payments, but hadn't given specific details about his concerns. The detective on the case, Sergeant William Murphy, had interviewed Cornelius Henderson twice. Henderson claimed that Garrett had been talking about leaving Chicago to find opportunities in California. According to Henderson, Garrett had seemed restless and eager for a change of scenery. However, Elizabeth Garrett said this wasn't true. She insisted that her husband had never mentioned California and had been making long-term plans for their family's future in Chicago. Thomas had recently signed a lease for a bigger apartment and had enrolled their oldest child in a fancy private school. The investigation stopped when no more evidence was found. Thomas Garrett's body was never found and the case stayed officially unsolved. Elizabeth Garrett moved back to her family in Pennsylvania 6 months later, taking her children with her. Sarah discovered that the construction company, now under Henderson's control alone, had become much more profitable after Garrett's disappearance. City records showed that the company got several big-paying contracts from Chicago's Department of Public Works throughout 1905 and 1906. Sarah went back to the enhanced photograph with new information about Thomas Garrett's disappearance. The mysterious figure reflected in the mirror had been at the Henderson family's Christmas party on December 25, 1904, just 3 weeks before Garrett vanished. She brought the image to a forensics expert at the University of Chicago. Dr. Robert Sterling had experience analyzing old photographs for law enforcement and academic research. His examination focused on the object visible in the reflected figure's hands. Using advanced digital analysis techniques, Sterling determined that the object was about 36 inches long and appeared to have a handle at one end. The shape suggested it could be a walking stick, umbrella, or possibly a rifle. Further enhancement revealed details that had been invisible before. The object appeared to have metal parts that reflected the room's lighting differently than wood or fabric would. Sterling's analysis suggested the object was most likely a rifle or shotgun. Sterling also analyzed the figure holding the object. The man's clothes appeared formal but less fancy than the Henderson family's clothing. His posture suggested he was not a guest at the party, but rather someone with a specific purpose for being there. The positioning of the figure standing behind and to the left of the photographer would have given him a clear view of the family during the picture session. He would also have been mostly hidden from the family's view, visible only to someone who knew to look for his reflection in the mirror. Dr. Sterling noted that the figure's presence appeared planned rather than accidental, with forensic analysis suggesting the mysterious figure had been carrying a weapon. Sarah returned to the Chicago Historical Society to search for connections between the Henderson family and anyone who might have had reason to threaten them. Margaret Kowalski helped find business records from Henderson's various companies. The construction company's files revealed that Thomas Garrett had indeed discovered money problems before his disappearance. Garrett had documented inflated material costs and fake employees on several city contracts. More importantly, Garrett had identified a pattern of kickbacks being paid to city officials in exchange for construction contracts. He had compiled evidence showing that Henderson's company was systematically overcharging the city for public works projects and splitting the extra profits with corrupt administrators. Garrett had scheduled a meeting with a Chicago Tribune investigative reporter for January 20th at the 5 days after his disappearance. The reporter, James McKenna, had been working on a series of articles about corruption in the city's contracting process. McKenna's notes preserved in the Tribune's files showed that Garrett had contacted him in December 1904, claiming to have evidence of widespread corruption involving multiple construction companies and city officials. Garrett had promised to provide documentation that would expose what he called a conspiracy to steal from Chicago taxpayers. The Tribune had planned to publish McKenna's investigation in February 1905, but the series was canceled after Garrett failed to appear for their scheduled meeting. McKenna's editor had decided the story was too dangerous to pursue without Garrett's testimony and documentation. Sarah realized that the mysterious figure at the Christmas party might have been connected to the corruption scheme that Garrett was preparing to expose. Research into Chicago's underworld of 1904 revealed that wealthy businessmen and corrupt politicians frequently employed private security and, when necessary, more dangerous individuals to protect their interests. The city's rapid growth had created opportunities for both legitimate prosperity and criminal enterprise. Sarah found references to a man named Vincent Vinnie Torino in police records from the period. Torino was known to Chicago detectives as an enforcer who worked for various business interests, handling problems that couldn't be resolved through legal channels. Torino's description matched the general build and appearance of the figure reflected in the Henderson family mirror. Police records indicated he was about 6 feet tall, wore formal clothing to blend into respectable society, and was known to carry firearms hidden beneath his coat. Detective reports from 1905 showed that police had questioned Torino about several disappearances and unexplained deaths among Chicago's business community. However, witnesses were consistently reluctant to testify against him, and no charges were ever filed. Most importantly, Sarah discovered that Torino had been employed by a group of businessmen and city officials who were involved in the same corruption scheme that Thomas Garrett had been investigating. This group, which included several of Henderson's business associates, had been systematically stealing money from city contracts for over 3 years. Torino's presence at the Henderson Christmas party suggested that the family was aware of the threat that Garrett posed to their criminal enterprise. The weapon he carried indicated they were prepared to eliminate that threat permanently. The timing was crucial. Garrett disappeared 3 weeks after the Christmas party, just days before he was scheduled to meet with the Tribune reporter. Evidence suggested that Thomas Garrett's murder had been planned during the Henderson family's Christmas party. The presence of Vincent Torino, captured accidentally in the mirror's reflection, placed him at the scene where the conspiracy was likely finalized. Sarah discovered that several of the guests at the Christmas party were later connected to the corruption scandal. City Building Inspector Harold Marsh, who had been present at the celebration, was fired from his position in 1906 following allegations of accepting bribes. Alderman Patrick Connolly, another guest, was investigated by a grand jury in 1907 for his connections to fraudulent city contracts. The investigation revealed that Henderson's construction company was just one part of a larger criminal network. Multiple companies were involved in systematically overcharging the city for public works projects, with the excess profits being divided among business owners, city officials, and corrupt inspectors. Thomas Garrett's evidence would have exposed the entire operation. His murder ensured that the documentation he had compiled disappeared along with it, effectively ending any threat to the conspiracy. The Chicago Police Department's investigation into Garrett's disappearance had been deliberately undermined by corrupt officials within the department itself. Several detectives who attempted to pursue the case seriously found themselves reassigned to other duties or facing disciplinary action. Sergeant William Murphy, the lead detective on Garrett's case, was demoted to patrol duty in March 1905, just weeks after he had begun focusing on Henderson's business associates as potential suspects. The conspiracy continued operating successfully for several more years, generating enormous profits for its participants while defrauding Chicago taxpayers of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The 1904 Henderson family photograph had captured more than a Christmas party. It had accidentally documented the planning of a murder and the continuation of a massive corruption scheme. Vincent Torino's reflection in the mirror provided evidence of a crime that had been covered up for over 70 years. Sarah's discovery explained several mysterious aspects of her family's history. The Henderson fortune had grown dramatically after 1905. Funded by profits from the corrupt construction contracts, the family had used this wealth to establish themselves among Chicago's most prominent citizens, contributing to charities and cultural institutions throughout the early 20th century. However, the foundation of their prosperity had been built on theft and murder. Thomas Garrett's children had grown up in poverty in Pennsylvania, while the Hendersons enjoyed the wealth that should have supported Garrett's family. Sarah faced a difficult decision about what to do with her discovery. The crimes had occurred decades ago, and most of the perpetrators were long dead. However, Thomas Garrett's descendants might still be alive, unaware of the true circumstances surrounding their ancestors' disappearance. She decided to contact the Chicago Police Department's cold case unit and provide them with the enhanced photograph and her research findings. While criminal prosecution was no longer possible, the evidence might finally provide closure for Garrett's family. The 1904 photograph, which had seemed like a simple family keepsake, became proof of how the past refuses to stay buried. Sometimes truth emerges from the most unexpected places, reflected in a mirror, captured by accident, waiting decades for the right person to notice what others had missed. Sarah's grandmother had preserved the photograph for 74 years, unknowingly keeping evidence of her family's darkest secret.